Hey, Jesse, good morning. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time. Looking forward to a great conversation today. Before we get into your background and cover off the topics we'll go through and finish with behind the data, first wanted to give the audience an expectation of the ideal outcome for today so they get a preview of what we'll be discussing. And so actually there'll be a little bit of a duality in terms of our conversation where we're going to help educate and inspire both the data practitioners and data professionals working in sports tied to your experience. And then to some extent also younger athletes or developing athletes because your range of experience is very broad in terms of the types of sports. So Aussie rules football with Brisbane Lions, at the collegiate level at University of Louisville, NBA with Sacramento Kings, NHL with Pittsburgh Penguins, and now you're at 1080 Motion, which I'll call a sports tech company. So your perspective from the in the club and now out of club is quite unique in, I believe, in general, and I think a first in terms of data and sports, in terms of the episodes we've had. So I'm really excited for that. Is that cool with you in terms of the outcome for today and what we'll talk about?
Yeah, that works for me. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. All right. So can we start with like your background? Because we like to start with the guest, where they come from, what they've done, and to help shape why they have that current point of view. I mean, maybe we want to start in all the way back to Australia, which like reflects what I'm wearing today, or please give us a sense of like who you are, what you've done to help the audience learn more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, shout out to Mike. He's bought an Australia branded shirt off Amazon in time for this podcast. So appreciate that. But yeah, so grew up in Australia in country South Australia, about 2 hours north of Adelaide. So a very rural community. I grew up on a farm there, and decided that I needed to kind of spread my wings for what I wanted to do, and that was work in sport. I knew from a pretty early age that wanting to play professional Australian rules football wasn't a reality, so I decided the next best thing was to work in it, and kind of through a strength of math and science and engineering and those kinds of disciplines kind of fell into the sports science realm. So went to college and did my undergraduate studies at Bond University on the Gold Coast. It was an accelerated program there, which was excellent because I wanted to get into the workforce as soon as possible. So a 2-year undergrad there. And then found myself doing an honors research year in tandem with being a kind of performance assistant with the Brisbane Lions, Australian Football Club. They're in the professional league there in Australia, the AFL, and held a couple different roles there. I was assisting with the rehabilitation side of things, helping with nutrition, helping with strength and conditioning, sports science, pretty much everything across the board. Was there for about 4 years, and then as also a US citizen, thanks mum, uh, decided I wanted to come and explore the US landscape for sport, given its magnitude, and in comparison to Australia, its enormity was something that was enticing for me at the times. Decided to come over, have numerous applications, and one finally stuck at the University of Louisville down in Kentucky, and was working for their Olympic sports program there for just over a year and a half. And that was kind of a 50-50 role with heavy sports science and data analytics, but then also 50% of strength and conditioning, working with numerous of those Olympic sports teams that were there. But mainly it was field hockey, women's basketball, women's tennis, a little bit of golf, a little bit of soccer, and a little bit of baseball as well, which was awesome. And that was really a different experience for me. That was, the proverbial drinking through a fire hose. It was exactly that. I mean, I came in, we had teams rolling every single day. It was a baptism by fire. It was extremely intense, but it was something that I think expedited my growth immensely within that 14 months, I believe I was there. And then following that experience, I had the opportunity to move over to the Sacramento Kings in the NBA in a pure sports science role. I was there in that role for a couple of years, and then kind of built back in the strength and conditioning side of things, working more applied with athletes during rehabs and that kind of thing. Worked my way up to a director role there, which was an incredible opportunity and incredible experience that was, again, shaped a lot of my perceptions around how we utilize data and how we train athletes and how we should integrate those two disciplines or sub-disciplines. And then after 4 years with the Sacramento Kings in 22, moved across to the Pittsburgh Penguins in the NHL in a similar role, similar capacity as kind of director of the performance and sports science side of things, working heavily with how we program and utilize data for our healthy athletes, how we monitor those athletes throughout the season, both on and off the ice, how we integrate with our medical staff to optimize our return to play strategies and reconditioning strategies. Just finished up with the Penguins back in June, I believe it was there for 3 years, and have just now joined 1080 Motion as Director of Performance Science, which is an interesting new role for me. It's one that's kind of an adjunct to sport. It's somewhat out of sport, but it's still within sport to the extent where I'm talking with coaches and sports scientists every day. I'm deep in our data sets and deep with our clients' data sets, helping them optimize their system, helping them optimize the solutions that they're looking for, whether that's from a reconditioning and a return to play environment for their players, whether it's upskilling their staff, whether it's assisting them creating different visualizations and different data analysis techniques with information. It's kind of a very much a front-facing role as Director of Performance Science, helping our clients optimize the use of 1080 Motion's tech.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And we will come back to the last part that you mentioned in a bit in terms of how now the point of view working at clubs has helped you in this current role. And there's like a nice juxtaposition there. Though let's start with the broad range of experiences you've had and go to a little more detail. I'll tie that to the first episode with Darcy Norman, where I misquoted him then. I'm going to misquote him again because I don't have the notes in front of me. That we talked about how like broad experiences or broad range of experiences are super valuable. That doing as much as you can in different areas, different roles with different people really helps shape your career. And so, like you said, you've had the ability to do that, which is phenomenal. And similarly to episode 8 with Luke Jenkinson, who's currently at San Diego FC and MLS, he had said how when he was going to uni in the UK, he wanted to get professional work experience first. He knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted to get some work experience because he thought that was the path that was right for him. And to me, I'm not saying it's 100% same as you, though, like you shared at the top, you knew what you wanted to do. You chose a specific path in terms of education and wanted to get into the workforce faster to get that practical experience. So I wanted to tie that together for folks. If they haven't listened to Darcy's story or Luke's story, I think they'll get a lot of value in seeing what might be a pattern in terms of having success. And that applies to any industry, right? Folks that are in other industries will probably agree that it's like you try to do what you can, especially at an early age. So as I mentioned, let's talk about go a little deeper from perhaps first the data perspective of the experiences you've had. So I'll keep it at a high level, comparing collegiate level to professional level, right? So you mentioned how you were in the Olympic sports side or area of Louisville. I guess for those that don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but generally speaking, with respect to colleges and universities in America, the way they're structured, it's usually like American football, and then everything else is put into Olympic sport. Is that generally right, or is
Yeah,
there a
probably.
better way to describe it?
No, I think you're pretty much right. I mean, that was probably spot on about a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago. But now, what we're starting to see with the increases in revenue and the increases in, I guess, the general stakes of these teams, that not only do football have their own staff, that men's basketball typically have their own staff. If you're, a top 20, top 30 team, men's basketball have their own staff. It's now shifting across to women's basketball. Some women's basketball programs have their own. Some baseball teams are now starting to have their own, and now we're even filtering into volleyball. Some really high-level volleyball teams, like top 2, 3, 4, 5, they have some of their own staff members as well that are exclusively working with volleyball. So we're seeing a shift to kind of a little bit more of a professional model in which each sport has their own kind of pod of practitioners. Those practitioners may also cross over into different pods, but they're taking a little bit more of a high performance approach in the sense that it's more collaborative around that individual sport as opposed to just purely a strength conditioning service provided.
Got it. Okay. So perhaps it was the case when you were at the NCAA level that my hypothesis would be perhaps less data used, maybe less tech within sports science to evaluate players at a deeper level, meaning in addition to body composition, things like DEXA scans, like typical, like you go to your doctor, get your physical. point of view. And now it's the colleges are more treated like pro sport. So, can you speak to at least when you were at the NCAA level compared to at the pro level? What were the major differences, perhaps from the purely data perspective, if there were any?
Yeah, I mean, definitely some that come to mind. I think when you're in the collegiate environment and when you're part of a strength and conditioning or performance staff that oversee numerous sports, we're talking, 5 to 10 sports, hundreds of athletes, you have to paint with a broad brush. You have to paint with one of those rollers that you roll up and down the wall. You need to collect key pieces of information that are going to facilitate better programming and more targeted programming and better monitoring over time. So they're really simple things like body composition, like you mentioned, aerobic fitness, strength assessments, and force plate assessments for lower body power and elasticity. Keeping it really simple, keeping it simple such that, because we're under such significant time constraints, obviously with the volume of athletes that we have coming through a facility, but also with the legislation and the rules around how much time you can have with these athletes, we painted with a very broad brush, which enabled us to target our programming more effectively and also compare within and across different sports, which is occasionally a really valuable tool. How that compares to the professional side of things is not only are they far better resourced, but we're only dealing with, I went from Louisville, hundreds of athletes that were coming into our facility to in the NBA, we only had 15, maybe 17, depending on injuries. So not only are
Right.
you more resourced from a financial perspective, is you can spend those resources on a much more finite or a much smaller population of athletes. So not only can you paint with a broad brush there, but you can also get a really fine paintbrush and start to really dial in a little bit more of an individual approach, or perhaps approaches that lend itself more to, okay, this player is dealing with X injury and X injury history. This specific piece of technology or this piece of data or this profiling solution might be optimal for him and maybe one other player. Let's do it because we have the resources. We only have 15 players, and this player specifically might be worth, a large portion of our salary cap. So
Yes.
the data is used in similar ways in the sense that we're going to collect it, we're going to profile it, we're going to prescribe, and then we're going to monitor. But the ways that we use that data or the resources that we have to apply that, both from a time and a financial perspective, are much, much greater in the professional scheme rather than NCAA.
Got it. Thank you for that. And so I'm going to make a juxtaposition to that point, tying this to corporate world, where there's, and I mentioned this on prior episodes too, there's data everywhere, technology everywhere, and in corporate land or non-sports, there is a trend of like collect all the data, collect everything. Sometimes you might not have a point of view of what to do with it, though there's a, I believe, naive belief that more data is better. Now, in many corporate environments, we'll say non-regulated industries, you can do what you want as long as you follow data privacy laws and all the rules and regulations. Regulated industries like banking, for example, healthcare, you have to follow very specific regulations. Both professional sport, as far as I understand it, and I'm now pretty familiar with the NHL CBA until it changes next year or next season. And I assume NBA CBA or collective bargaining agreement is somewhat similar. Is it quite similar also with respect to like NCAA bylaws and or university bylaws where you can't just collect everything for collection's sake, that it needs to have a specific purpose to it? Like, can you speak to that a little bit? Like, people might look at that as like a constraint to say, oh, we can't do this, though that might help keep the focus. Curious on your take from that perspective, being a practitioner in two professional sports.
Yeah, that's a question I don't think I have a great answer to, just because the collegiate landscape since I was working there in 2017 and 18 has changed drastically and continues to change drastically on a seemingly a daily cadence. When I was there was no real regulations around what we could collect and how we could collect it, as long as it was within the hours, the allocation hours that we were able to collect it, and there was no HIPAA kind of compliance issues there. So if we were collecting something more on the medical side, that would become an issue. But if it was strength indices, power indices, anaerobic fitness or aerobic fitness pieces, that wasn't as much of an issue for us to collect, or not an issue as much as a hurdle to collect. These days, I'm very much positive that there are much tighter regulations around what can and cannot be collected. And that's kind of similar to the frameworks that have been used in professional sports, such that, that data can't be used punitively. The data can't be used to, for example, supply the coach with certain information that maybe encourages the player or the coach to put them in the transfer portal. Like all of those kinds of things that apply to data in professional sport, I think we're starting to see trickle down into the NCAA. All to say that the NCAA sports, especially football and basketball, they're starting to look a lot like pro, both on the court and off the court. So I think it's smart that these governing bodies are now starting to, look at what the professionals are doing, what the leagues are doing in terms of data privacy and utility, and applying that to the NCAA. So it's not just the Wild West, which it seems to have been for the last 3, 4, 5 years through this crazy kind of period of change.
For sure. And similar to that, and this is not the topic for today related to NCAA, though, from what I've heard from coaches, administration of various universities, this whole NIL period is like the Wild West because it's like a free for all. But as we've seen, as we're seeing, like we saw with what you described with the data collection, there's more regulation coming on board to help create guardrails so that there's consistency for folks. It's, from my perspective, a good thing because otherwise you have chaos. So before we move into the next area in terms of like how your experience at these clubs has helped you at 1080, I'm also just curious, and it might be a brief answer, was there a large difference from your experience from NBA to NHL from the sports science, human performance perspective when it comes to data collection and use, or is it generally somewhat similar?
Yeah, so people ask me this question a lot, and it's similar in the sense that we're trying to collect similar constructs. We're trying to collect these physical qualities that underpin the demands of the sport. So the process in which that we take to profile these certain components is very, very similar. We look at the bioenergetic demands, we look at the biomechanical demands, we look at all of these different demands. So the process in which we take to identify those is the same, yet the actual demands and the actual key physical qualities are somewhat different from basketball to hockey. For example, in hockey, you're obviously on ice. We're not jumping, we're not landing. So the demand for robust tendon stiffness and robust elasticity isn't as prominent as perhaps hip and groin strength and hip and groin congruency with the skating stride. So those are that's just one example, sorry, where they do differ. But as I mentioned, the process in which we take to identify those demands is very much similar. So that may lead us down different pathways for the different tests that we may use, the different data that we may collect, and consequently the different technology we use to collect and monitor those different demands and pieces of information.
Well, very nice. So I'll use the analogy or descriptor of it's like the wide or broad T versus a tall or short T, or a tall T versus a broad T, meaning that there is value in having that broad, wide experience across one sport to another because it applies. At the same time, there is nuance sport to sport, like there is business to business or industry to industry, where it does get a little more granular and you have to understand, as I've said, and I think every episode, the context of it, and the context does matter. And so, again, from my perspective, when we were chatting before this, kind of plan for, hey, what could we talk about? I mean, look, that was the coolest part for me is like, you've seen so much across the spectrum that's where at least my curiosity comes from is like, what are the similarities? What are the differences? And I'm sure others will want to know too. And that's what we'll get into a little bit later too is like what advice you'd have for professionals who are earlier on in their career. So thank you for that foundation in terms of your background, how that's helped shape your point of view across experiences. Now, again, another topic or area that I find super fascinating because I had done similar in like the B2B space and in a little bit different direction is, like you said, you spent most of your career at the team level, at the club level, and now you're kind of like outside of it or adjacent to it. I call the broader space sports tech because the sports ecosystem is growing, it's getting more complex. The tech around it supporting it is growing, getting more complex, which has pros and cons. But I'm curious though, again, speaking to your own personal experience and perspective, like can you elaborate on how your time at these clubs has helped shape even just like how you engage with them or speak with them when you have your 1080 motion hat on?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I thought about a lot when I was considering and ultimately taking the role with 1080. But if we backtrack back to my time in Sacramento and even more recently with Pittsburgh, I was constantly, under a time crunch. Obviously, things can change rapidly. You might go from a nice, clean roster to maybe 2 or 3 injuries in a couple of days, and your life just completely changes. So, all that to say basically is you alluded to it earlier, is that everything and every piece of technology these days can collect really high quality, really dense data sets, essentially. So we can collect everything to 1,000 hertz. Everything's extremely accessible now as well, being able to provide the practitioner and the teams with their own data in these high fidelity ways. So what I was constantly battling with is I wanted to have the time to work on all of these kind of slow projects, I like to call them, balancing that with the fast work. So the fast work is like, there's an athlete in front of me I need to coach. There's a practice coming up in an hour that I need to prepare for. There's a team strength and conditioning session that we need to get set up. The slow projects are, more of the sports scientist realm, looking at, how does our practice trends leading up to a game in the past 3 years affect our game outputs? They're those slow kind of tracks. And now that we have more data than ever, we can start to look at all of these different slow projects and how those different data sets relate to each other. Well, sitting in that seat in Pittsburgh and also in Sacramento, I just wish I had someone that can kind of work as an adjunct to what we were doing in the fast aspect to help me answer those slow questions and complete those slow projects. And who better to do that than some of these tech companies like 1080 Motion, like Catapult, like Vord, like a lot of these other really prominent sports tech companies. So that was kind of my thought and my pitch to 1080 is, we should be kind of an adjunct consultant to our clients to facilitate them to perform these slow projects, to basically to help them discover these solutions or discover how they can optimize their program, whether it's 1080 or not. It should be an integrated approach with all of these different data sets. So how I kind of use my experience in that realm to then optimize or maximize my utility as a practitioner now with 1080 is I've sat in that seat before. I know you're under a time crunch. What are some of these slow questions, or how can I chip away at things on the back end while you're working on coaching the athlete, running the rehab session, monitoring that practice? How can I help you on the back end to then feed forward some of the results of these projects faster for you, that they impact your day-to-day practice faster? So that's kind of where I've been sitting, and that's kind of what I've been up to for the last couple of months.
So, a couple really cool things there from my perspective. To tie to episode just before this, so this would be number 10, episode 9 with Zoya from Orgo. She was in banking for like 20 years, raising 3 kids, involved in all sorts of sports, and had a pain point within her family and was like, I'm opting out of this banking world. So these are my words, not Zoya's necessarily. Opting out, voting myself off the island. I'm going to go fix this. And what I'd said to her from my observation and advice that I just gave more broadly to the audience, again, based on my experience, is those who deeply understand the problem, or those who most deeply understand the problem for experience, are usually the most apt to, or best suited to, provide the solution, or at least show the path to solution. And so we can tie that here to your experience, where you made a decision, concerted decision, to have a new experience, we'll call it, right? Using your prior experience to fill a void that you thought you had, or that you had, right? So you came at it from a consultative perspective and said, I understand this very clearly because this is what I wish I had. And so now when you come to these clubs with your 1080 motion hat on, you are, from my perspective, genuinely coming to them with that consultative perspective and like, hey, I am here to help you because I have been in your seat. It's not another vendor, air quotes vendor, saying, here's more data, use it.
Yeah, good luck.
Right? Yes. And we see that across a lot of industries. And Zoe and I spoke to this too, that, it's just economics. When there's opportunity, competition comes in. And with the advent or more prolific use of things like AI technology to allow us to create these apps or solutions, and I'll speak specifically to B2B because that's what I've been in for 12 years before this, is people are like, I know the answer, I'm going to solve it, but they haven't lived it or lived it for that long through various cycles to really understand what it looks like on the day to day. So I just wanted to tie that to the conversation with Zoya because like just talked to her about it. And again, similar to what I talked to previously with Luke about that in terms of like, I know what I wanted. Here's the path that I took. We've taken a similar approach. So, can you then speak to? I mean, we're not necessarily jumping forward or back in the conversation, though. I want to ask you or frame the question this way because you mentioned this notion of balance of fast projects, slow projects. There's
Yes.
also, I mean, balance in everything is important, though there's also this balance of analyzing the data and looking at the data compared to communicating with, could be the head coach, could be an assistant coach, could be a player who's healthy or injured. Can you speak to it from that perspective? Again, maybe even going back to the club days or at 1080, how you speak to the staff of these clubs of then how do you translate that messaging so the athlete ultimately is the beneficiary in many cases can understand the why behind it.
Yeah, this is a huge one because this is agnostic to industry. Whether you're in economics, business, agriculture, or performance or sports science, you have to know your audience. You have to know who you're communicating with. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, and it's kind of a not a tactic, but something that I always do, I always go try to elucidate what is your system? What do you believe in? There's in the strength and conditioning industry, there's many different schools of thought. There's many different approaches that can also lead to similar results. There's no one optimal kind of program out there, but what do you believe in? What style of training do you believe in? And secondly, what is your issue? Like, what's the problem? What is the actual
Right.
issue? Chances are I've had a similar problem myself and I can empathize with that. So now that I know the system that they believe in, the problem that they're having, and the audience that I'm talking to, using those three pieces of information, you can put in their own words, direct to the problem that they're having, to the people you're talking to, a solution or a potential pathway to a solution. And if there's no solution that exists, let's create one together. Because again, that's something I can lean on with my kind of diversity and experience that whether it's a field-based sport, a court-based sport, on the ice, from a technology standpoint, I think I have a decent enough approach or a decent enough network as well around me that we can get to a solution. We can get to the bottom of this together. So know the audience, understand their system, and understand the problem. I mean, like you mentioned before, sorry, the solution or the quality of the solution is probably directly proportional to how well you understand the problem or how deeply you understand the problem. And understanding the problem is, skin in the game. It's sitting in those seats that they've been in before. It's them feeling comfortable that you've actually felt a similar way to them in the past or a similar frustration or a similar issue that they've had.
No, for sure. And I want to tie that what you just said about how you have a network, others you can lean on, resources, your own experiences to something that I've experienced in my just day to day in terms of speaking with staff at clubs is they are very curious. So to say it's not American football, it's soccer in America, I call it football. Say it's a football club that I'm speaking with, they want to know what other sports, like what other teams in different sports are doing. Sure, they're curious what teams in their league are doing from competition perspective. They don't want to get left behind or be last, but they're usually most keen and ask me like, Michael, what are like they doing in the NHL? Like what are hockey teams doing or what is cycling doing? Do you find that also if you don't like initiate to say, hey, here's what I saw in Australian rules football, or if you're talking to a hockey team, here's what I've seen in the NBA, or here's what I've seen at the collegiate level. Like, are they asking those similar questions and they are as curious to learn? Like, what don't we know? What's another way we could think about it? We're there, then you can again fill in the gap in terms of the information, but also the way to communicate it. So it's you meet them where they are and speak in their specific language.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the short answer is yes. I think that one of the advantages I find at it's a double-edged sword because going, for example, from NBA, from basketball to hockey, there's no ice hockey in Australia. I've never skated. I had no idea about the sport. I couldn't even tell you what an icing call was or what any of these things were. So that's a disadvantage. But those things can be learned. I can learn the rules, I can
Sure.
learn to skate, I can learn all these things. But what can't be learned is the fact that I have an unbiased view coming in and looking at the sport, the program, the traditions, all of these things. I don't have this biased view of, oh, well, we have to do these things. And upon reflection, that was a drawback for me when I was in the AFL because I'd played the sport my entire life. I'd done many pre-seasons for high school and college level. Not that college is very high level over in Australia, but had played football my entire life up to that point. So I had these preconceived notions of what was important, things that we had to do, which can be an advantage, but if not looked at critically, can also be a disadvantage. So you have to understand the why behind all of these things. So in terms of how we draw different similarities on how these teams are curious or if they are curious, I would say, yeah, absolutely. Because I think the really good practitioners in sport, whether it's football, NFL, hockey, basketball, soccer, whatever, they understand that the approaches or the problems that they're having are similar to other sports. It's simple questions like, how hard should we train today? How should we determine if our players are tired or not? What's the best way to rehabilitate a hamstring injury? The hamstrings are not only soccer injuries, hamstrings are rife throughout the NFL right now. Achilles
Yep.
injuries in the NFL and in the NBA, they're very common injuries, unfortunately, these days. We would be remiss to not reach out and discover different techniques and different ways of doing things. And I think, as you mentioned, the good staffs and the curious staffs, they're looking outside their own biases to determine, are we missing anything here? Is there a way that we can maybe change slightly our process based on other practitioners that have also had similar issues? I think it's not agnostic to the performance industry either. I mean, growing up on a farm in agriculture, it's the same thing. I mean, we would go on farm visits. We'd go to different locations in the state and go look at how they're farming wheat or how are they farming oats. It's further together. It's that kind of the old adage, further together.
Yeah, for sure. And I used to have this mentality of, alone you can go fast or alone I can go fast. And as I get older, more experienced, I realize it's like, yes, further together, that just going fast isn't necessarily the best outcome. You have to find the balance. So thank you for elaborating on that. Before we wrap up with the behind the data segment to learn more about you outside of sport, outside of work, you've given a good amount of advice for the data practitioners and professionals throughout. And I'm going to ask a couple questions from like the athlete perspective as well. But just really briefly, is there like a high note in terms of a piece of advice that you have for the data professionals or practitioners, whether they are working in sport today or are considering it, that you'd give them as like a key takeaway or leave behind to consider before taking that jump, or if they want to implement it to advance their career?
Yeah, in terms of advice that I would provide, and this is kind of a reflection on the advice I would give myself a decade ago, is always ask why. And that's not necessarily other people, but ask yourself. Always ask why. It's very easy, especially in the data world now within sport, is to go, oh, all of these other teams are using X technology. We have to get it. But let's just take it one step backwards and say, okay, all these people are using this technology. Why are they using it? Oh, they're monitoring lower limb stiffness with that. I work in basketball. Lower limb stiffness is really important. Connection made. Let's get the technology instead of just black, sort of blatantly as a broad brush, just going every piece of technology that everyone else has in the NBA, we need it and we need it yesterday. Just ask why first. It's a very simple tactic and not one that's novel by any stretch, but I think it's one that unfortunately I overlooked a couple times in my junior career. Still make that mistake to this day sometimes, but it's something I have to catch myself on and something that I think leads to better outcomes if asked early and often.
For sure. We see this in other industries. It's not my name for it, though it's this shiny object syndrome. Everybody else is doing it, so we should too. And I think back to when I was more of in a sales or BD role or strategist role in B2B, I would ask similar questions to what you ask these clubs and teams is like, what are you trying to do? Like, what is the problem you're trying to solve for in very simple terms? Like, what are you trying to do? And then what are the systems that you're using? What are your processes? What's your workflow like? Because that operational aspect matters and can go overlooked also. And that can sometimes help get to like, why are we doing this? Because they might realize, or you might realize, we should not be doing this. This doesn't nearly fit, or we need to think of it as a slow project or more long-term project because there's adjustments we need to make in the interim. So again, it comes into everything in balance. I did want to ask, we focused a lot on the data professional perspective, which I think is a great approach based on your experience. I mean, personally, being a big hockey guy, I can't go into the last segment without just asking you, and I'm not going to ask for the names. And in a prior episode with Wei Lun Fu, who's the performance nutritionist Tottenham Hotspur, I asked a kind of similar question because he works with some of the top Premier League or top footballers in the world, and he in his PhD research used data subjects within Premier League as well. And so I asked him a similar question, which is based on, because you've worked with some of the top athletes in their sport, right? I mean, especially like the Sidney Crosbys in ice hockey, which most people should know. And so the question is there any advice just based on your interactions with these top athletes who are the best in their sport, a takeaway or some piece of advice that the younger or developing athlete should think about or work on if they want to get to that elite level? And it could be something very obvious or not obvious, because I'll give some of the context. As I had asked you before this, like, hey, like, were you traveling with the teams, or was it one of the roles where you kind of, stay at home, so to speak? And you had said, not to put words in your mouth, like, as a practitioner, you have to be there with the players, you have to be there with the staff. It's a person-based business. And you've already alluded to this, is helping them understand, why are we doing this? But I'm curious, and I'm sure others are too, are there any lessons from like the athlete perspective, from the person who wants to become elite, on something they should start doing or think about based on what the top in the world are doing, whether it's NBA, NHL, what have you?
Yeah, I think two things come to mind, especially when we look at that real elite top tier athlete, the Sidney Crosbys, De'Aaron Foxes, these level of athletes. That the first thing that comes to mind is very similar to what I just mentioned, is they do ask why, and they are very curious,
Wow.
because performance staffs these days, like we've spoken for the last 30 minutes, is data is everywhere, new interventions are everywhere, different data collection techniques. These athletes are curious. They're like, hey, what does this do? How is this going to help me? And that's something I would empower any athlete to ask of their sports scientist, their performance coach, their physical therapist, whoever they're working with, is be curious and ask how this is going to help me. Because the more educated you can be on the different inputs that you're putting into your body and into your system and how you're utilizing those inputs, the more educated you could be. And then the more experience that you have in what works for you. If you can understand what these interventions are that these well-versed sports staffs are providing you, you can start to get a really good idea and take ownership over your own program as an athlete to determine, oh, okay, this monitoring technique works great for me, or this recovery technique works great, or this metric from this monitoring system is actually really valid and matches up with what I feel. And that's going to be symbiotic in the sense that it's going to help you as the athlete, but it's also going to help the staff surrounding you provide better overall care to you as well. And then the
Oh, really,
second
really
thing,
appreciate that. Oh, sorry.
no.
So keep going.
One last thing is that the true elites, again, the really high levels, they compound habits. So they don't switch out habits. They don't say, okay, I'm going to work on my recovery this week and then nutrition. I need to work on my nutrition. So recovery goes by the wayside and then it's nutrition, or then it's mobility, or then it's, massage. The really good athletes will compound those habits, like this and this and this, as opposed to or. So there's some of the things that I've noticed with the really elites, is they're not phasic in their approach to the care of their own career. They're very much compounding those habits to maximize the outcomes.
That is such amazing advice for everyone, because I believe, generally speaking, from the outside in, we think, oh, they must be doing something special. And they are. Many of them have an innate talent or ability and just natural skill or IQ for the sport. Though oftentimes we see is that they're doing the basics, or what seem like the basics or the boring things, over and over and over and over again, and take an interest in what they're doing. Ties to what Jacob Bickerstaff in the second episode said about his time in Michigan with men's tennis, which is a very much individual sport. And I asked him about this from the staff perspective. He's like, the nutritionist can tell you what to eat. They're not going to like force you to eat those things. That's still on you. Or your strength and conditioning coach is going to tell you do these reps. They don't know if you're, my words, dogging it or if you're actually putting in the effort, that you, the athlete, have to take ownership of what you're doing and empower yourself. And I love that because it's a simple reminder of like, just ask why. Not necessary to question, to be contrarian, but so you can understand and learn and then act on it yourself and become, it's for lack of a better term, smarter about the process. And as you get older, you understand what works for you. And then you can communicate that to other coaches and staff along the way is like, here's what I found works for me. Here's the why. And then when they implement or provide you with other modalities or interventions, like you said, it's a symbiotic relationship of what works so that everyone can get the ultimate outcome, which is your development and the team winning. So
Exactly.
appreciate you, really appreciate you sharing that. Again, I had to ask. Last but not least, let's go behind the data. So we started with you in terms of your background experience, which again, phenomenal to get the understanding of where your point of view comes from, these broad range experiences and trying new things and really knowing what you want. Now we're going to finish in that way in terms of asking you some questions like I alluded to outside of data, outside of sports, so we can get to learn more about Jesse the person, more than
Sure.
we have. So, four pretty easy questions. Is there a place or a location that is very special to you or close to your heart? And if you want to share why, you can.
I mean, it would have to be my hometown. I mean, it would have to be. It's a really small town of about 200 to 300 people, 2 hours north of Adelaide in the middle of nowhere, quite frankly. The name of the town is Butte, Bute. Again, it's where I grew up. It's where my family farm is. I still have, a lot of family that live back there. I get back there as much as I can, but it's just so different from what my life looks like now, from what my life did look like when I was 5 years old. It's just special in the sense that you can always go back and there's always a soft spot for home for everyone. So maybe a generic answer for you, but it certainly applies in this context.
Generic is okay. What matters is what does it mean for you? And we often get an answer tied to where a person's from, especially if they've immigrated to another country, they're working somewhere else. It does go to the expression, there's no place like home. So shout out Butte, Australia.
Nice.
And I'm not going to try to guess the next answer because I'm wrong every time I make assumptions. So I'll just ask you: is there a comfort food or a go-to you have that you just really like or appreciate, whether it's homemade or from a restaurant?
Yes, I mean, I'm huge on Mexican food. I love Mexican food. There was this place called Mezcal Mexican Cantina in Pittsburgh that we fell in love with. It's probably the restaurant that I've been to more than anywhere else in my life, and we were only there for 3 years. It was an institution for us. The food is awesome. The people are awesome. That was somewhere that every time I go back to Pittsburgh, I'm going to take some time out of my day to go there. It was a really awesome spot and just so many good memories from that restaurant.
Amazing. I'm adding to the list because Pittsburgh, seeing a Penguins home game has been on my list for a very long time. And a regret I have from being younger is I never went to the Igloo. Maybe I was too young, though I still put that on myself. So I'm gonna check out Mezcal Cantina in Pittsburgh. Okay,
Please.
last two questions. Is there a song or what's a song that puts you in a mood or gets you focused or gets you pumped up?
One particular song, I'm a very phasic music fan. So maybe one week I'll be into, old school Australian rock. And then another week I'll be into more of the, electronic indie pop or something like that. Like I'm very phasic, but something that I always fall back to. And I went to that concert live in Pittsburgh back in May before I left the city was a bit of AC/DC always does the job. If you're trying to get up
Nice.
for, whether it's a workout or whatever it may be, really. AC/DC is just something I never skip. It's a no skipper, as I like to call it.
Awesome. Yes, I would agree with you as gets you in the mood or pumped up, and I think a couple of their songs are very common in arenas around the world
No
to get the
question.
crowd going too. Okay, last but not least, you've given us a bunch of advice and recommendations based on your experience. This question has that slant too, in a way. Is there a book that you've read in the last year or two that's had an impact on you or taught you a lesson that you want to share with others to check out?
Great question. My music taste, I guess my reading acumen is quite phasic as well. I'll go through a book stage and then a journal stage and then a podcast stage. And my last book stage, I really love anything by Malcolm Gladwell. I'm a fan of. He's stuff is awesome. I
Yes.
reread Outliers, actually. Outliers is one of my favorite books for, things that are in plain sight. They're right there. If you think about it a little bit more critically, there's patterns that arise and there's these really cool insights that you can garner if you just take the time to think critically, do the research and do the work. You can find these really cool patterns that are just hidden in society everywhere. And I'd like to think that there's some carryover from that into my profession, just from a critical thinking standpoint. Impossible to measure and to quantify, but they're hard to put down, his books. I find them quite enthralling. So I really enjoyed that one.
I am 100% with you on that. That is a fantastic book. Outliers, for those that haven't read it, you have to at least once. So we'll end with that. Jesse, thank you so much again for taking the time. Really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun, and thank you.
No worries at all. And thanks for the shirt. The Australia roots are driving deep. So thanks for your time. Appreciate the time.
Anytime.